Thanks for coming, and thanks to people online. I think there is at least one person online. Thanks for joining us for this last III lunchtime seminar of the term, and therefore of the academic year. Marcela, I'm delighted to have Marcela Eslava, to introduce Marcela Eslava today. Marcela is a professor of economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, in Colombia, and she's at the moment visiting in Barcelona, where she's speaking to us from. Marcela is one of the leading applied microeconomists in all of Latin America. She does really interesting work using microdata from firms and workers and the interaction between them. She's also currently the president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, and she was a very important part of our Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review that some of you know about. So it's a pity that Marcela was originally going to join us in person. It's a pity that couldn't happen, but we're delighted to have her nonetheless. She'll be presenting a paper on jobless industrialization. And I just should say that Marcela asked that if people have any questions, that she would actually like to be interrupted with questions. Because it's online and it's kind of difficult, if you raise your hand, I will shout. So feel free to interrupt if you have questions, particularly of clarification. Marcela, the way the cameras are set up, you can't see half the audience, but there are people back there, just so you know. Okay. All right. You're muted, but please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so as Chico said, I was so much looking forward to being there, but unfortunately couldn't travel. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to a discussion with you. As Chico said as well, I'm happy to be interrupted. This paper has a lot of technical content, technical specialized content, and I know the audience is varied in terms of the technical background that people carry. So especially if I'm losing people with technical details that people in the audience need not be aware of, just interrupt me and I'll be happy. I'll try to just focus on the more substantive issues. As I said, I'm really interested in hearing your reactions. This is a paper, I hopefully will be clear on that, that has lots of questions on economic policy with implications for both inequality across countries and within countries. And so in that sense, this is an audience I'm particularly interested in hearing from in terms of reactions, both in terms of whether you find this interesting, but also controversial. So this is joint work with Laura Alfaro, Martin Mercieri, and Felipe Sáenz. And it is a paper on whose title we've debated. We're still unsure of whether it's jobless industrialization or jobless modernization. You'll see. But it is, in general, a paper in which we are concerned with the generation of, let me loosely call them, good jobs in less developed economies. Our concern is that less developed economies not only feature lower levels of income compared to the richer economies, but a very important part of what we understand as the development problem has to do with their inability to generate what I'll be calling modern jobs for the time being. Think of this as good jobs in a number of dimensions. And this inability threads through different features of less developed economies that have troublesome implications, and some of those are listed here. The literature in which this paper is subscribed is more the macro development literature, whose main interest has been to explain the aggregate income gap between less and more developed economies. And because that has been the main interest, there are important facts of the development, important features of less developed economies that this literature largely overlooks. And we want in this paper to first characterize some of them, and then secondly, try to understand them. So as I said, we'll focus on this modernity concept. There are four important facts that I'll be trying to shed some light on today, both in terms of characterizing them and, as I said, explaining. One is what we call jobless modernity. And it is the fact that this modern segment weighs as part of the overall economy less if you think of it in terms of jobs than if you think of it in terms of the generation of income or value added in the economy. So here's an illustration. Here's a set of countries, some from Latin America, one of the less developed of economies in the middle income range. And we compare them in this picture to richer economies in Europe and the US. The darker blue is the weight of the modern segment in this particular picture, and throughout the paper, we will characterize this modern segment as the segment of productive units with at least 10 employees, and we'll talk about why. But that's what the definition here. And that segment weighs much more in terms of value added than it does in terms of employment in the overall economy. So this is the divorce between the dark and the light blue bar for LATAM. If you look at the richer economies, there's much less of a divorce, arguably no divorce in those economies. Here's another way to look at the same problem. This is the industrialization part. If you go back to the peak of industrialization for different countries, and let's now redefine what modernity is for that time. Let's think of the industrial sector as the sector that was modern at that point in time. And you can see here again that if you compare countries that industrialized early, most or them in general being today advanced economies, and you compare those to the late starters to the industrialization process, there is a very clear differentiation in terms of how much industry, again, featured here as the modern sector, weighed as part of total value added versus employment. So you see no divorce at the peak of industrialization for early starters, a little bit of a divorce, but not as marked later. Whereas if you compare that to a set of late starters from Africa, Asia, Latin America, there is a very marked divorce. The industrial sector weighed in value added, actually not that far from the weight that industrial sector had in value added in the early starters, whereas in terms of employment, its weight was much lower. So that's what we're going to call joblessness in the modern sector, be that the sector of larger firms or be that the modern sector of activity in the economy. So that's fact number one that we're worried about. Fact number two is that in general, modernity has been less present in the less developed economies. So if you look at it here, from this picture, the weight in either of the bars is much lower for the modern sector compared to the weight that it carried in the more developed economies. Then fact number three is what justifies us calling these a modern segment. So think again of the firms with 10 or more employees. Why do we call them modern? There's a series of features of employment or engagement in the segment of 10 or more employees that has more modern features, and that's the reason we call these a modern segment. So here's a picture from a different paper that's correlating income levels for the workers and the type of firm they're engaged at. The lighter blue is what we're calling now the modern segment. That is to say, people who are engaged in firms of at least 10 employees. whereas the other darker colors have to do with self-employment without employees or people who are engaged in micro businesses of 1 to 10 employees. And the feature that I want to highlight from this picture is if you look here at Latin America, again, as the example for which we have data of less developed economies, you see a very marked correlation between the earnings of the person from the first to the 10th decile and the fraction of workers who are engaged in this modern segment. So in that case, in that sense, the modern segment carries larger earnings for workers, and in that sense, it is modern. Again, this is a feature of less developed economies, not necessarily everywhere. If you look here as an example to the US, there is some correlation. There's a little bit of a gradient here, but it is clearly much less marked. Another way to think of the modern segment is its correlation with informality. In this picture, informality is featured in the shaded areas, and you can see that informality is almost fully concentrated in the what would be the traditional segment, the dark blue and middle blue categories of micro enterprises and the self-employed. So it is in that sense that this is that this segment is modern.
Sorry, can you hear us?
I do.
You do. Okay, sorry to interrupt. I'm trying to stay to the spirit that you wanted to be interrupted, but apparently I have to scream, so it's a little. But I just wanted to ask you. You had the early adapters and late adapters graph. Does that graph include only Latin America, or does it include Asia? So talking about industrialization around the world without talking about Asia these days seems odd to me, right? So is this about comparing just Latin America to the developed economies, or are we including other countries there? You do have Malaysia, Philippines, and so on. So that could be very different, right? So that could be very, so my question, two questions about this graph. One is, how should I see this graph, which includes regions that are, I guess, much more industrializing in Asia as compared to Latin America? So how does it relate to the other graphs, which only have Latin America? And second, what you've got on the horizontal axis is log GDP per capita, which makes sense. But obviously that means that the points at which countries were at, certain shares of manufacturing are different in time, right? Between the two graphs. And so I guess my question is about this huge divergence at the peak for late starters, which you don't see for early starters. Would that be happening at the same time? And I'm using time here to proxy for technology, as you see the divergence on the other graph. So, maybe technology changed and capital labor ratios changed dramatically in industrial processes at a certain time. And that happened to be, when advanced countries were at 10.5 on GDP and Latin America was at 9, or Asia was at 9. So those are two questions: sample composition, time and technology.
Yeah. So in terms of the more objective question of what is in the picture, this includes early starters from all regions and late starters from all regions. So all of this has to do with the point in time in which they started their industrialization process. And then on your I wouldn't call it a second question, the second set of questions. The kinds of issues that you're raising is exactly the kinds of questions that we are making ourselves. So this paper also wants to answer what part of these phenomena that we're characterizing here could be explained by differences in the technology that's available. So for instance, you may think, looking at this picture, well, of course, the late starters by definition started later, so the times do not coincide. You're correct about that. Does that mean that by the time these late starters started their industrialization process, the technology that was already available was much more labor saving, much more automatized, and therefore they needed less workers to do the same, to generate the same value added? And maybe that's the reason these countries are less jobless. So that's one question. The only reason to show you Latin America in the other pictures is data availability. I would love to show you the other pictures for different regions in the world. We have very limited numbers of those, and the surveys that we have for those countries do not allow us to fully portray what I showed you before. But one thing we do know is, for instance, this correlation here is replicated for India, Pakistan, and Nepal. If you look at the more urban part of the population, which is the one that what I'm trying to say is for regions that have a similar urbanization rate, where the traditional segment is not fully dominating. And similarly, the US is not our only comparator. You would see something that's similar to the US if you portrayed Europe or countries that today, these pictures are for today, countries that today are more industrialized or more advanced.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me just talk briefly about the last fact, and we'll move precisely to where I think Sheiko was leading us. The last fact is that there are sectoral differences in modernity, and in particular, some sectors are more modern than others, and that's true even today. But this picture here is for the peak of industrialization. Then this is for one specific country, Colombia, for which we have data at that point. So what I want to show you is the fact that the gray bars here are much higher, say in industry, and then intermediately high in services, but much lower in agriculture. And those bars are the weight of the modern segment, these firms of 10 or more employees in those sectors in terms of value added and modernity. So this is the sense in which sectors are different. And to summarize, to start with, our theory of sectors here our theory is more about modernity, and sectors end up weighing more or less in the economy depending on how modern they are. And so that's sort of a backward way to get at sectors. And so the paper is more about this modernity than the sectoral differences.
Marcela, can I
Sure.
just a clarificatory question? So modernity is just working in an enterprise with 10 employees or more. Is that the only criterion, or is there something else?
The way in which we define this in the data is precisely what you have described. Working meaning either being an entrepreneur or a worker in one of those businesses. And the reason to operationalize the definition in that way is again driven by what data allows us to do. So the answer is yes. And because of what you're saying, there will be some confusion here between what's firm size and what is modernity.
Like, for example, not having a written contract or not having benefits, or using electricity, for example, or not, things like that. Could also
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those are features, as I showed here, very correlated. So this definition of informality that I showed you here is precisely not having benefits for Social Security tied to your employment. They're very correlated, but that's not the definition we're going to use here. And you'll see that we actually will find and try to reproduce another fact that you can see here, which is what we call modernity. These larger businesses are more formal, as you see here, but you can also see that there is informality everywhere in the income distribution, and that there are small businesses everywhere in the income distribution. And so the fact that there is some content to the word modern. There is a differentiation between this segment and the segment of microenterprises and self-employment. That's one leading theme, but we also work very hard in trying to make sure to reproduce the fact that there's no perfect segmentation, and that you do have some high productivity and high income in micro enterprises and in informal businesses. Okay, so with this background in terms of the data that we're motivated by, these are the questions that this paper tries to address. So one question is, why has this modernity been jobless in these regions? And in particular, we're going to try to disentangle the effects of three different sort of sets of explanations. One, the first point here, what I call distortions, given the literature this is ascribed, and you can think of as policies. Are there policies that distort the modern segment in these economies that say early industrializers, for instance, didn't face, or that are not as strong in those countries? And given that this is a concern about the generation of jobs, is this specifically related to policies governing labor, payroll taxes, minimum wages, other ways to fund social security in these countries? And we're in particular interested in learning whether those policies are lean more against the high productivity firms within modernity, those that will be more able to generate high value added and therefore generate large bases of modern jobs. And that's one set of questions. But we also ask, how about, as Chico was suggesting, labor-saving modern technology, or how about deficits in basic capabilities, and in particular in human capital of different types? So that's one question. And then another question is, to what extent this really matters. Does it matter that people sort into firms that are smaller, and in particular micro, or that they work self-employed? And in what sense it matters? Does it reduce the aggregate income? That is to say, that the allocation of workers to traditional segments is not only an allocation, but also what we call a misallocation. Does it generate costs in terms of aggregate income? Or does it matter for equality, and in what sense it matters for equality? So this is the set of questions that we are after. And the way we do this is a general equilibrium macro model with lots of details on the micro side of the economy. The reason to do this in that sort of setting is that we do not want to explore the effect of one policy. We want to be able to see the interactions of different policies with technology, with human capital. And so in some sense, the only reasonable way that we see to try to answer such a broad but also detailed set of questions is creating a laboratory where we can try all these different explanations, and a laboratory that's very, very deeply rooted in data and that can reproduce the facts of these economies. So because of that reason, what we do is we try to quantify and assess the magnitude of the effects of different policies. And in particular, we would look at payroll taxes, minimum wages, distortions, what we call revenue distortions. You can think of those if you think of policies in terms of corporate income taxes, distortions to capital, and you can think of those in terms of credit constraints. And compare that to human capital that we will distinguish between embodied human capital that's useful for any type of occupation, that being self-employed or a wage worker, etc., or human capital that's specific to entrepreneurial innovation. And so we lay out this general equilibrium model that has what we call occupational choice, that is the sorting of people into these occupations. Again, our occupations are going to be being self-employed, being a wage worker, or being an entrepreneur in the modern sector. and it is a model where the traditional and the modern segments use different technologies. So we believe that with that and carefully modeling the heterogeneity that we see across agents, that in the model results also in heterogeneity across firms, we will show that we're able to reproduce the set of facts that I showed you at the beginning. And then we use that, we tie it very closely to the data, using microdata for Colombia on workers and firms. And we do that for the peak of industrialization. Why concentrate at the peak of industrialization? As I said at the beginning, there's this tension between understanding segments, the modern and the traditional segment, and sectors of the economy, industry at that point in time versus agriculture, or today, modern services and industry versus more traditional services in agriculture. And one way to try to minimize that tension between sectors and segments is concentrate at a point in time where one sector is clearly more modern than others. And that's the reason we use data for this. You'll see the data requirements are very stringent. And so we take advantage of the fact that Colombia has been collecting detailed data, their household survey from the 70s. And also firm level data at a very detailed level from the 70s. And the 70s is the time when the peak of industrialization occurred in Colombia. And so we use that very rich data to quantify our model. So we basically write this theoretical model, bring it to the data to find what are the parameters of the technology and the preferences of agents, etc., that really reproduce this economy, make sure that our laboratory economy reproduces the facts that I showed you before, and then use it to say, oh, what happens if I change this policy? What happens if I change the technology in a plausible way? What happens if I change the human capital in a plausible way? To try to get the answers we're looking at. So as I said, I'll jump over many of the technical details and just try to give you a very broad sense of the model and take you directly to the results. Let me just say that compared to the literature, the main advantage that I see of what we're doing, or the main contribution that I see in what we're doing, is bringing all these angles in a very disciplined manner together, so that we're able to reproduce not only the income gap with respect to richer economies, but also these different facts that I walked you through. And that implies bringing all these dimensions together. The models in that literature I was referring to reproduce the income gap and have paid a lot of attention to the distortions side of the economy, but they're more theoretical in the sense of trying what happens with one explanation. Bringing the interaction of them together requires this more elaborated laboratory, and we see that as our main contribution. I'll just give you a flavor of the model, and I'll take you to the results. So what we have is, we basically have an economy where what's important is people and their ability to produce and to produce in certain ways. So we populate this economy with agents in the number of workers that Colombia had in the 1970s. And we asked those agents to choose between being an entrepreneur, a modern technology operator, or a wage worker in a modern firm, or being self-employed. And our modern firms, our operators, will hire workers, and they will face constraints given by policy. So they will face a minimum wage. They cannot pay their workers less than some minimum wage. They will face corporate income taxes they will face payroll taxes and credit constraints, and those could be correlated with productivity in the sense that the more productive firms may be more or less liable for these taxes, and we inform the quantification from the data. So we actually will see in the data whether these firms are more or less paying higher or lower payroll contributions, for instance. Because only the modern firms face taxes and the minimum wage, our model basically boils down to thinking of modern as though it was the same thing as a formal firm, and traditional firms as though they were the same as informal firms. And so answering Ashani's question from before, in the model, this is much more simplified and we see both dimensions together. But again, taking it to the data, the definition that we use is whether the firm has 10 or more employees. And we will have a representative consumer who has preferences over the three sectors. So how much I buy from agriculture, industry, and services. And within the three sectors, between modern and traditional, or formal and informal, some people may like, or people may find it more or less substitutable to buy from a large department store compared to the mom and pop store in the corner. And then they have preferences over the modern firms, but are indifferent between different traditional firms. And the importance of that last fact is basically we are characterizing modern firms as producing differentiated goods. So our innovative ability here will be the ability to innovate, to produce differentiated goods. Basically, just to give you a flavor of what the model does, here is what we have. This picture, the pipes here, A, which is the ability of an agent to produce, this is the embodied capital ability. So it can be taken to being a worker, or to being a self-employed, or to being an entrepreneur. And what the worker basically does is chooses between the three different occupations, but facing some constraints. So the convex line here is the profits the person will earn as a function of their ability or of their embodied ability. And higher ability means I'm able to produce higher profits. And this convexity here is very standard in these models. It basically inherits features of the technology. The modern technology here is a technology where you mix labor, capital, and materials. And so your ability as an entrepreneur is basically increased by the fact that you are complemented with these inputs, and that's the reason that this line is convex. So it grows faster when you have more ability, because those spillovers create this convexity. The blue line is what you would earn as a self-employed worker. And so the fact that the dark line goes above the blue line for the higher A means that higher A people would prefer being an entrepreneur over a self-employed person, and the opposite will be true for the lower A people. And the orange line is what you earn as a wage worker. That also depends on how productive this person is, his or her embodied human capital. And that line has to lie either right on top or above the blue line. The reason for this is that in the model, we also allow for some ability that's specific to being self-employed. So there's always going to be some people who are self-employed, and we're trying to capture their preferences towards working on your own, or specific abilities for boutique businesses. And so there's some tension that brings some people to self-employment. Given that tension, if the wage weren't high enough in the formal sector, there wouldn't be anybody who would want to be a formal worker. But preferences require there to be some production of modern goods, and so the equilibrium wage is high, and so that implies that this orange line lies above or immediately on top of the blue line. And
Marcela?
so, yes.
I may have missed it, but what's the difference between self-employed and entrepreneur?
So so there's two types of entrepreneurs here. The self-employed are the traditional entrepreneurs, and the modern entrepreneurs are the ones who own a modern firm. So the modern entrepreneurs hire other people and produce with this technology that mix other people with capital, etc. The traditional entrepreneurs own their business, and basically they produce alone. They don't hire other workers, and that's the difference between them.
But if they hired less than 10 workers, then they could be.
So in the data, they have a very small business. In the model, this is very simplified, and we treat them as self-employed. You could introduce more detail in the model, but we're trying to create a laboratory that's as simple as possible, still reproducing many of these facts.
Okay.
So actually, one criticism to our model is it has way too many details, and so that's one that we're abstracting from.
So just to follow up on Ashwini's question, in some senses, the technology, isn't it? Because if you're self-employed, you just have this linear technology. You produce your ability A, the blue one, and then if you are an entrepreneur, you get to hire capital, which is D, I guess. Is D capital? Or?
No, I'll talk about D in a second.
Okay, but you got this other technology, right?
Exactly.
Which is convex. And
exactly.
So
for the economists in the room, here's the production function for a modern firm. So you hire labor, capital, and materials, and you have your productivity A.
Okay. And then you had said in an earlier slide multidimensional abilities, but here everything is in a single dimension.
Yeah, so let me defer that for 2 minutes. I'll get to that. So
okay, and then
yeah.
Sorry, I'm just gonna add all my questions at once, and then you can reply to them whenever you. So, you know, some of these occupational choice models in the context of development, as you know very well, including old ones like by Banerjee and Newman, and I think there's a paper by Raquel as well, they introduce other things like credit market imperfections and wealth, right? So you don't have access to a modern technology. It could be that you are high ability but low wealth, and if you can't borrow, then you don't have access to that technology. There's nothing like that going on here, right? As perfect credit markets.
No, there's no perfect credit markets. The way this is modeled here is if you're facing a credit constraint, you're facing a higher interest rate. So that's why what I called a capital tax. So in that sense, you face that. What we are not modeling is a direct cost of entry that you have to pay for, and so you depend on your initial wealth. That's not going to be a barrier to enter here. But you may face higher capital constraints, and we actually find in the data that that's true if you are a smaller business compared to a larger business.
So the credit market is imperfect, but production sets are convex. There's no non-convexity in production.
Exactly. And back to your former question, indeed, the picture is unidimensional. So this is a function of A, which is, again, the embodied human capital. And so basically what the picture shows here is, given the wage is relatively high, if people cared only about their income, they would all choose to be modern workers if they could, compared to being self-employed. But some very high A people would choose to be modern entrepreneurs. And this is basically a very standard occupational choice model. We're not introducing anything here. Where is it that we're introducing stuff? So the first thing is this minimum wage. So you see the horizontal line there. What it implies is a firm cannot hire you if you are if your A is lower than this crossing point here. Basically, you do not produce enough income to the firm for them to be able to pay you the minimum wage. And so only workers with at least these A will be hired as modern workers. So that's constraint number one. You may want to become a modern worker, but you would not be hired if your A was low enough. So that's one difference. Difference number two is some people may have a preference to go to self-employment. And there's lots of evidence in developing economies that people have pointed at that suggest that that maybe in these economies people are more or happier to go do that type of jobs. And so if that were the case, this is one of the multi-dimensions now answer your other question, Shiko, that we introduced. So basically that would shift the blue line up and down depending on who you are and what your preferences are, and that would allow you to choose self-employment even if you were a high A person. And then finally, there's this D dimension that you were asking about, and that shifts the profits around. And that dimension, what it does is it captures innovative ability. So this is an ability that's specific to the modern sector, producing differentiated goods. And so that's what you have here. If you're a very high D person, then you would face the dotted line, not the solid line, and that may make you become an entrepreneur, even if you're not very high A, but because you are very high D. So those are our multi-dimensions. So in terms of human capital, we're going to have here an ability that you can use anywhere. So you're good at reading, writing, communicating, and analytical skills, and that serves you well in any occupation, either of the three occupations we have. But you may also have specific abilities to be self-employed, or more generally, back to Ashwani's point, in the traditional segment. Or you may have actually abilities to be a transformational entrepreneur and fund a business that is prone to growing and producing at large scale. And this is, I think, a summary of what goes on in the model. If you faced taxes, obviously that would also shift your profits thing. If you pay corporate taxes, then for any given A, you would receive less profits. If you pay more payroll taxes, the same thing happens. If you're more credit constrained, the same thing happens. And that's basically a summary of what goes on in the model. So what we do is we take this very seriously to the data. We infer the distributions of A in the data from the income of the self-employed and the wage workers. We infer the distribution of the ability to be self-employed from the numbers that we need to be able to reproduce how many high-income people are in the traditional segment in the economy, the non-segmentation that I referred to before. And we infer the D distribution in the data from the returns that the entrepreneurs have to their businesses, and that's basically the differentiator that they face. The way we infer that from the data is we estimate the demand curve that every firm in the modern segment faces. And in the model we write, D is actually a shifter of the demand curve. So if you have a better product, you're more innovative, you face a higher demand for your product, and that's what we get from the data. So this is all this detail. Let me now take you to some numbers and hopefully to the policy messages. So in the data, here are some interesting facts. These are the elasticities that we estimate in the data for the different factors. And what's important here is this gamma L is the elasticity of production to employment. Higher L, or rather lower L, means a more labor-saving technology. So what we're estimating in the data is that technologies do change. And for instance, that from the 70s to the 2000s, in Colombia, it has become more labor-saving. And this is one fact that we will use. So one of our counterfactuals, one of our experiments will be to ask, we're modeling the economies of the 1970s with the parameters on top. And then in a counterfactual, we will ask, what happens if the technology evolves to be more labor saving as it did towards the 2000s in Colombia. Here's another set of facts that we find in the data. These are the correlations of our quote unquote taxes with the productivity of the firms. And what we find here implies that the wedge that we're identifying that will be equivalent to a corporate income tax is indeed higher for the high productivity firms in within the modern segment. The payroll taxes that they declare paying, so the payroll taxes are measured directly in the data for each firm. Payroll taxes are actually higher for the larger firms within the modern segment. And back to your question on credit constraints, actually the interest rate is higher for the smaller businesses in the modern segment. That is to say, they are more credit constrained. So with all of that, we model our economy. Let me say the economy we model looks similar to the economy that we have. And our model would suggest that the industry is more modern in the sense of consumers buying more modernity when they buy industrial goods compared to, say, agricultural goods. And let me now move to our policy experiments. And here's the kinds of things that we do. Let me start with the first point. We ask what happens if we reduce the minimum wage. And we do here crazy experiments like, experiments that would not be feasible from the point of view of policy, but that are illustrative. So we take out the minimum wage and we take out the payroll taxes. Yes.
Sorry, just before you go to the policies, because I'm a little bit lost, can you go back to the lambdas that you just had, that table?
Sure.
One, yeah. So there are 3 sectors, and you have data on these agricultural firms and service firms and manufacturing firms, right? But you
and this is the share that they represent in the overall economy. And there's actually these numbers in the upper part represent the aggregate of the sector.
So this is my question. I guess my question is, you're allowing the phi's, and I forget exactly what the phi's are, but you're allowing.
I didn't present the model, but those are preferences.
Okay. That's okay, but you're allowing the phi's to vary by sector, but the lambdas don't. So is in that sense, are you basically forcing these elasticities?
No, the lambdas are the weight in preferences of the sectors. So they're by definition sectoral. And the phi's are within a sector, how much people prefer modernity versus, or buying from modern firms compared to buying from traditional informal firms. So this is just by construction.
The production function, the form of the production function is the same across sectors, but the parameters vary. The parameters can differ.
The production function is, just as you said, the same for modern firms across sectors. The production function is linear for the traditional segment in every sector, yes.
And the parameters can vary across sectors.
So we are not we're not introducing differences across sectors other than the preferences of people. So this is the sense in which I said in the beginning, the weight of a sector depends on the preferences of people.
So in some sense then, say this elasticity of I guess some measure of marginal product of labor, some elasticity of output with respect to labor and materials and so on, what you're doing effectively is taking some sort of weighted average of that across sectors.
Yeah, so the data that we have for firms is for the manufacturing sector. So given that, and that's, as I said, the reason we concentrate in the 70s. So we concentrate in the 70s to be able to match modernity to only the manufacturing sector, which is the one for which we have data. We estimate these gammas for the firms in the manufacturing sector. They're actually, you're right, we estimated separately for each subsector of the manufacturing sector. And what I showed you is, you're right, the average across subsectors of the manufacturing sector.
But then when you're going to take it to the new data, you're going to take it those parameters to all sectors, including agriculture and services.
That is correct. For the modern part of those sectors. What's going to be different is that the modern part of that sector is going to be less bulky in the agricultural sector. And those are these three numbers that I was showing here. So the modern part is going to weigh way more in the manufacturing sector, less in services, and almost nothing in agriculture. And
isn't that a problem? I mean, you're fitting technological parameters from a very different sector, manufacturing, into agriculture and services, right?
In a sense, we're arguing that what makes these sectors different is, in a sense, we're arguing that a big agro-industrial producer is not that different from a big industrial producer. And what makes them different is whether they use these modern technologies and they are modern in that sense, rather than they being agricultural or industrial. What we're saying is, you think of the industrial sector as different from agriculture, but that's because you're thinking of a rural producer with a small plot and comparing it to a large textile producer. If you actually took a large agro-industrial producer and compared it to the textile producer, you wouldn't think they are so different. So that's the theory of sectors that we have in this model, and that's indeed one of the central arguments.
Okay, and I'll let you go into the policies now, but just last little question on this is, so, I mean, you have materials, right? So surely the elasticity with respect to materials, which is i.e. land, ought to be very different, even between modern agriculture and modern industry.
Yeah, that is true. One problem, or the problem we have, the reason we do this, is that the super detailed data that we need for firms is not available for agriculture or services. We need data on what you produce, the value that you produce, labor, capital, materials that you use, and the individual prices and quantities of each product that you produce for every producer in the sector. And that's what's very unique about the Colombian data for the manufacturing sector, which is the reason we use those in this paper.
Thank you.
But of course, if we had that data, that'd be fantastic. So let me actually summarize, given that we have very little time, just let you give you a flavor of what we're finding. So we're finding the first headline is both reducing these taxes or distortions and increasing human capital, be that embodied human capital A or this D. Both things increase aggregate income, that is, they would reduce aggregate income gaps with respect to more developed economies, and they reduce the joblessness. So both have the same impact. But there are very important differences in how much they reduce that and who wins and who loses within the economy from this. So the basic headline is, in this economy, the Colombian economy of the 1970s that had a relatively low minimum wage, only 17% of people earned less than the minimum wage, and that's very different from Colombia today. But in this economy with a low minimum wage, reducing the minimum wage has little bite. It increases the aggregate income and it increases modern jobs, but not by that much. And but one important insight is in terms of distributional consequences. Of course, formal workers are hurt by reducing the minimum wage. The gap of their income with respect to modern entrepreneurs is expanded. But the self-employed are actually helped by reducing the minimum wage. So there's, rather than the traditional employer-employee characterization, what this model brings is this three-group characterization where you can see distributional impacts from one to the other. So, so that's number one. Number two, reducing the taxes is really powerful here as well. Especially reducing the dispersion of taxes. So the fact that the taxes are higher on the high productivity firms, if you reduce those, there may be, and in our experiments, our crazy experiments, just shutting them down, there is a very large gain in aggregate income in the region of 40% gain of aggregate income. And there's also gains that actually trickle down to everybody in the economy. However, the corporate income taxes, reducing them helps the entrepreneurs the most. Those are the ones who gain the most. And reducing labor or payroll taxes actually helps the formal workers the most. And the reason is that the payroll taxes are imposed on firms, but they pass those on to the workers in the form of lower wages. And so when reducing those, not only there's more income, but that income is more shared with the workers via a higher wage. Now, having said that, human capital is even more powerful, and especially human capital that's embodied, that you can take to any occupation. There's a large debate in policy about when you devote money to creating productive abilities, where do you put that money? There's a large literature devoted to managerial capabilities. And the actual implications of that literature have been to create programs, for instance, extension programs, typically directed to the formal sector, where governments invest in managerial capabilities. So those would be D in our model. We move D, we move A around, and what we find is that A, which is the embodied human capital, is much more powerful. So to give you a sense, rather than showing you numbers that may be confusing, if we increase A, human capital, in what would be equivalent to increasing average years of education from 5, which was the average number of years of education of workers in Colombia in the 1970s, to 9, if you were able to do something like that, then that would basically double aggregate income. It would favor the most people who remain in self-employment, but it would favor all groups. And that would have a very large impact in reducing joblessness. So not only the people who remain in self-employment will have much higher income, but you also will have many less people in self-employment and many more in the modern segment. The impacts of that sort of a policy are in the range of, as I said, doubling aggregate income and increasing from 15 to 30% the fraction of people who are in the modern segment. The D increase, the managerial capabilities are also powerful. So they increase aggregate income. Let me check the number here. We actually needed to implement a much larger increase in D. The increase in A that corresponds to the years of education that I gave you is a 25% increase. The increase in D actually needs to be much larger for a smaller gain in aggregate income, not doubling, but multiplying it by 50%. That's, of course, non-negligible. But that would basically be all going to the people who are already in the modern segment. So you would increase very little the fraction of people who are in the modern segment. And that would basically be all reaped by the modern entrepreneurs. And then finally, and very interestingly, I thought, labor-saving technology does have some costs in generating modern jobs, but it is so powerful in increasing productivity that it enlarges the modern segment enough such that the net effect is actually to increase modern jobs. So that would be the first experiment here. As I said, what the experiment does is changing the gammas so that they become the gammas that we have today rather than the gammas that we had before. That is like cutting by half the elasticity of production to labor. And that has a very large increase, carries a very large increase in aggregate income, and it increases modern jobs, not by a lot, but by a non-negligible 3%, rather than reducing them, despite the fact that it is labor saving.
I have been remiss as chair. I should say that you only have like a minute or two.
Yeah, no, that was the summary of results. Yes.
That's it. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't get to these results before, but if people have reactions, I'd be super happy to hear them. I'm very interested in hearing whether you think or what criticisms do you have to the way we address this and the policy messages that emerge from them.
That's great. So if Stella will allow us, we'll take an extra 5 or 6 minutes and ask if there are any questions. Javier and then Ashwini.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcela. I was just wondering how this general equilibrium model aligns with the studies over time in terms of increased human capital. So there's evidence for at least the effect of cash transfers in Latin America, where we see that, I mean, there was a big impact in terms of educational attainment and enrollment, but it hasn't translated into entry to formal employment. But education has increased, human capital has increased, but these people have not entered formal employment. So how does this align with your findings about, this simulation about increased human capital and how this translates into modern firms, for instance?
Let's group the questions if that's okay,
Yeah.
Marcela.
Sure.
So we have one from Ashwini and then another one from me, and then we'll see.
Yeah, so, great talk, Marcela. I'm not an expert on this kind of modeling, so I can't tell what's going on. But, I was trying to think of India's case when I was listening to your results. And so in India, 90% of the workforce is in the informal sector. And in the last 3 decades, there's been a spectacular expansion of education. So human capital in India has really expanded rapidly for all segments. Yet joblessness and educated unemployment is also at an all-time high, especially for women who are getting educated in increasing proportions, but are not being able to find jobs in the labor market precisely because of this dichotomy where the formal sector has very low employment elasticity. So it adds a lot of value to output, to GDP, but doesn't really generate employment. And then there's a vast informal sector, which is very employment intensive, but low productivity, all the rest of it, that. So it's very hard for me to understand how an increase in human capital is just resulting in lower joblessness. It's what's linked to the question that was asked earlier. Yeah.
And my question also is linked exactly to the same point. So at least it's going to be easy to answer them. But Javier was thinking of this literature on CCTs, I guess, and I was thinking of this other literature on riff regressions and other microsimulation things, which I've also worked on, and many other people, where what we saw in Latin America, looking, for example, in Brazil from 1976 to the 2000s, which I have an early paper on, what we have is a huge increase in education, which translates into almost no changes in income because the returns to education fell. So, there's a sort of market reaction there. The demand for skills clearly had not risen. And so since the demand for skills had not risen, the increase in skills just translated into a lower price for skills, right? So the question specifically here is whether, because you've got this sort of technology-driven parameters, whether the wage rate, which is that sort of linear premium, the AW versus A, whether that's adjusting when you do the policy simulations, or whether you are keeping the returns to human capital fixed when you do the simulation, in which case you would be ignoring this market response, which is directly following, I think, both questions.
So all of these questions on surprises of why what we seem to find in terms of human capital, or what we find in terms of human capital, does not seem to fit some prior expectations. So let me give you like a generic answer and then specifically answer each of these points. The generic answer is, one thing we're very interested in is use this apparatus. So this full set of results is in the last 2 or 3 months, we've gotten our first full set of results. And now that we have them, we are very interested in trying to replicate the evolution of the Colombian economy from the point in 1970 to the point in the 2000s. So we had similar questions to what you had, to those that you're raising. Things such as, well, Colombia did increase years of education a lot. Why has the income gap not closed as much as the model suggests? Why has modernity not risen as much as the model suggests? And I think the nice thing about the model is that compared to other types of analysis where you can take one channel, is it can combine them. So suppose the answer is you increase human capital, but you also increase the minimum wage by way more. So now the minimum wage is at the 50th percentile of income rather than the 17th percentile of income as it was before. Or how about it is the combination of the technology parameters of the gammas, which we're changing here in one experiment, but we're not readjusting the whole model to it. How about is that combination? So I guess what that means is we haven't fully used our model to combine different changes in quote unquote policies or other features of the economy in interactive ways. We have tried experiments where we have moved a couple of them at the same time. So for instance, interestingly enough, reducing the dispersion in the credit constraints is actually good in the model. So if you take out labor payroll taxes, but you also take out the dispersion in the implicit taxes to capital, the latter sort of help in the model. And the reason is because the latter are falling harder on the smaller businesses within modernity. And so they are not allowing people who are in the margin of being in the traditional sector or in the modern sector, they cannot move fully easily to the modern sector because they would face very high credit constraints. Whereas if you are a very super high A person, you would face less constraints. So that's one interaction we have. We have already explored interactions with the minimum wage, and something of the flavor of what I anticipated we think is going on for the Colombian economy happens. So if we increase A, but we also increase the minimum wage a lot, the two effects eat up each other. And we could try experiments such as the ones that you're mentioning. So my hunch through the lens of the model is something like that is part of the explanation of the phenomena that you're suggesting. So Chico, you were already suggesting, well, probably when you're moving at the same time the taus and the gammas, or the human capital and the gammas, the interaction between those two may be part of the explanation, and that's true. And I have take a note to try that type of experiment. I'm thinking to what extent that that captures the returns to labor, and I think it does not fully, because here you're paid W times A if you're a wage worker. It is true that the equilibrium wage adjusts, and so if you increase the abilities in the economy, there's more supply of the skills that the modern segment needs. That does decrease the equilibrium wage, but it decreases it proportionally to your A, and so it may not be fully captured, and I think that's as I mentioned, that may be part of the explanation. But then, going now to the question of the conditional cash transfers. So my reading of that literature is different from yours, I think, and I think it has evolved a lot in the last few years. So for the Mexican case, it's very clear, I think, that in the initial Progresa program, the kids had reaped little benefits from that education right after the program. But the more recent papers that have taken a longer horizon look are finding interesting positive effects on both engagement in the labor market and formality. And that's, I'm thinking of the paper by Horacio and others on the Colombian program, the Colombian Familias en Acción program. And as far as Ashwani's question on India, and in general, all these questions, there is one gap between the micro evidence and these more macro. So in the micro evidence, so the macro model is basically sort of subsuming all the pros and cons effects and getting you a number from adding the different dimensions. In the micro evidence, you sort of have to look at, to be able to have good identification, at the beneficiaries and their impact in a very local way with people who are very much alike them. And so, I guess one question mark that this raises is to what extent the micro evidence on which we're framing those, or on which we're basing those readings of what's going on, are providing a very partial look at the problem, and whether the more aggregate evidence is more aligned with this. So in general, for all of the questions that you raised, I agree with all of those concerns. At the same time, even though, for instance, as I said, Colombia has not closed the income gap with the US, but that means that it has grown as fast as the US. And so it's not like there was no growth. There has been significant growth. There has been significant structural transformation. There has been significant modernization of the economy. It may not be pari passu with the models, with the predictions of the model, which will have to point at either the fact that we're running partial effects, or the fact that the model is very rich, as I said, but it's of course a model, and so in that sense, it does not take all of these angles into account. Now, having said that, I think these are all very important points, and I'll make sure to try to, as much as we can in new experiments, try to address and answer those questions. I think these are all important questions that we need to ask ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. We must leave it there because of time. I just want to say, before we give you a final quick applause, that you would be interested to know that we are sitting today, and you would have been, in the Sir Arthur Lewis building. So that's very suitable for your modernity paper. You've just presented it in the Arthur Lewis building. So thanks very much, Marcela.
Fantastic. Great location.